Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and I don't know if you've heard, but there's this game called Five Nights at Freddy's that's basically taken over the world.
I don't think anyone saw this coming. A horror phenomenon based on Chuck E. Cheese. It's ludicrous, and yet, strangely enough, it works. The combination of limited gameplay, the creepy aesthetic, and the vague hints of storytelling all congealed into a surprisingly effective horror game. Yes, the novelty has worn off thanks to all the imitators, but it wouldn't even have imitators if it didn't work in the first place. Now it's become a multimedia franchise with a fandom big enough to rival Star Trek and My Little Pony, the latter of which has seen a shocking amount of crossover with FNAF.
Full disclosure, even though I am familiar with the lore, I haven't actually played the Five Nights at Freddy's games myself. I have read the book, Five Nights at Freddy's The Silver Eyes. Boy, did I read it. Let me tell you something, folks. It's a good thing this wasn't the world's introduction to the FNAF franchise.
The story is set in 1995 and follows a teenage girl named Charlie who returns to her hometown of Hurricane, Utah some 10 years after leaving in the wake of a horrific string of child murders, the worst of which was the death of a wonderful little boy named Michael. Said murders were all connected to the now-closed establishment Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a whimsical restaurant full of games, rides, and animatronic characters designed by Charlie's father. Joined by her peers, who have also returned to honor the memory of Michael, she discovers that the restaurant is still there. When they venture inside, they discover that the horrible events of the past have affected the restaurant in some very unusual ways.
So what can I say about the Silver Eyes that's positive? Well, for a 389-page long book, it moves along at a very brisk pace. I'm the sort of person who likes to savor what I'm reading, and even I zipped right through this. As for everything else, though, yikes.
The most obvious problem with this book is that the focus is in the wrong place. If you know anything about Five Nights at Freddy's, you know who the primary characters are. The security guard controlled by the player, the mysterious purple guy, the unseen phone guy, and most importantly of all, the animatronics. Assuming there's no crossover between any of those categories, that is.
Those characters are the focus of the games and all of the fan-generated work. So you would think they'd be the focus of the book, or at the very least prominently featured, right? Well, they should have been, but they aren't.
In fact, the animatronics are hardly in the book at all, and don't really play significant roles of any sort until the final chapters, and I mean that as literally as it can be interpreted. This isn't one of those times where the monsters aren't quote-unquote on screen all that much, but their presence is felt throughout. No, for all but the final chapters of The Silver Eyes, Freddy Fazbear and friends are actually bolted to the stage they're on, making them little more than set dressing. How are they able to uproot themselves and move about at the end? Shut up, that's how.
Getting away from the animatronics, this will be a bit of a spoiler, but screw it, I don't care. In the book, it's revealed that William Afton, co-owner of the Freddy Fazbear restaurant, is indeed the infamous purple guy. Which would have solved one of the major mysteries of this franchise if the book weren't set in its own timeline, which renders that whole thing pointless. And he is just as mishandled as the animatronics, if not more so.
Even though he's obviously the villain from the start, he's written in a way that makes him seem like a different character each time he appears, with no consistency at all. This especially applies to his murderous side.
Now, serial killers generally don't target people randomly. There's a specific kind they go for. There are patterns that you can follow. Jack the Ripper, for example, killed prostitutes.
We know from the previous murders that Afton specifically kills little kids, but when he shows up again, he starts going after teenagers and 20-somethings because that's how old our heroes are and he has to be a threat to them. You know, in the Friday the 13th movies, the reason horny teenagers were always the victims is because the Voorhees family has had bad experiences with horny teenagers. They didn't just kill whoever was there, they had triggers, like actual serial killers do.
But what really kills the Silver Eyes is how it's written. Now, I'm sure some of you think I'm about to tear into series creator Scott Cawthon and call him an awful writer, which no doubt means you're poised and ready in the comments section to start a flame war on the topic. Well, you'll just have to bring that fight somewhere else, because I don't think Cawthon actually wrote this book. Oh, he came up with the story, and his name deserves to be on the cover for doing that, but I don't think he actually wrote it, because it doesn't match up with his style.
Looking at what little bits of narration and dialogue can be extracted from the games, we can get a very good sense of Scott Cawthon's writing style. He specializes in short to mid-length sentences which are very straightforward, yet leave a lot unspoken. The inference is that whoever is being addressed already knows a lot about what's going on, then a crucial detail is dropped to hint at the larger story, and the rest is left to people who make theory videos on YouTube. Love it or hate it, that's how Scott writes.
Getting back to the book, you'll note there's a second name on the cover, Kira Breed Risley. According to the About section, she is both an author and a playwright. And once I had that particular detail, I finally figured out what bothered me about how this book was written.
It's not written in Scott's style. Really, it's not even written as a proper novel. It's written in that flowery, repetitive, overstuffed, real people don't actually talk this way style reserved for only the most self-important of off-Broadway plays. It's a style that thinks it's poetry but can't make up its mind on how poetic it should be, and thus comes across simply as half-baked and often gets labeled as pretentious.
I'm not a fan, in case you couldn't tell. Now imagine taking that particular style and applying it to the most cliché slasher movie you can think of, except the killer doesn't show up until the very end, and you'll start to understand why this book is insufferable.
As a final nail in the coffin, The Silver Eyes isn't even scary, which is the worst thing you can say about a horror novel.
The best kind of horror isn't the stuff that shocks you or the stuff that disgusts you. It's the stuff that disturbs you, gets under your skin, forces your mind to go to some really dark and disturbing places and contemplate things that you otherwise wouldn't. I can't say The Silver Eyes really does that. It's not scary. It's not disturbing. And I shouldn't be saying that about something whose plot is set in motion by child murders.
Part of that is the flowery writing, which fails to properly convey anything disturbing. Part of it is how Purple Guy and the animatronics barely show up. And part of it is how the characters are just so poorly portrayed.
Most of them are just bland archetypes barely distinguishable from each other. But the few who do stand out as recognizable really do not work.
One girl named Marla is always dragging her younger cousin around, and she treats him like dirt, always snapping at him and telling him he's being bad when he's not doing anything at all. She comes across as completely unlikable. Then we learn that she's keeping Jason with her because his parents are getting divorced, and that's supposed to make her sympathetic because of the strain it's putting on her.
How selfish do you have to be to make the divorce of another little kid's parents all about you? And the fact that Jason doesn't find out about the divorce, and as far as I know, never does, means he's nothing but a plot device in the end.
Meanwhile, our protagonist Charlie is clearly meant to be quirky, but reads more like a Martian who learned human behavior from bad soap operas and teen romance novels. I've tried figuring it out, speculating that maybe she has PTSD or high-functioning autism, but nothing really fits. She's just written in a way so confusing, even she doesn't seem to understand what she's thinking half the time.
Then there's Michael, the last child to have been murdered before the events of the book. This kid is just too darn perfect.
He was smart, funny, talented, studious, well-behaved, never did anything wrong, everybody knew him and loved him, and even though 4 other kids had been murdered previously, it was his death which tore the town of Hurricane apart. Screw those other kids, they were brats. Michael was the one who walked on water and cured the lepers, which is why he gets to be Golden Freddy. Oh yeah, Michael is Golden Freddy. Whatever.
Look, I know you're not supposed to speak ill of the dead, but the way Michael is described is so darn saccharine, I'm amazed it wasn't sarcastic.
Look, I could go on about this for hours, but I don't want to keep you here all day, and I don't want to keep dwelling on this book. The fact of the matter is that Five Nights at Freddy's The Silver Eyes sucks. It can't even justify its existence by answering the mysteries of the franchise since it's set in a different timeline. Unless you're a super fan who must own anything and everything FNAF related, this really isn't worth your time. Go read some Edgar Allan Poe instead.
I've heard speculation that the reason this book exists is to give the planned Five Nights at Freddy's movie more of a solid, clear plot than the games provide. If that's the case, this is one of those rare times where I would encourage Hollywood to throw the book out the window when adapting it. Which is something I'm going to do right now. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer, signing off. Blah!